A presentation of the South Carolina Educational Television Network. Major funding for the Voices and Visions series is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Annenberg Media.
Additional series funding is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Special funding for this program is provided by the New York Council for the Humanities, the Seth Sprague Educational and Charitable Foundation, and the Axe Houghton Foundation.
Poetry. I too dislike it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. In the days of prismatic color, not in the days of Adam and Eve, but when Adam was alone, when there was no smoke and color was fine, not with the refinement of early civilization art, but because of its originality, with nothing to modify it but the mist that went up. Obliqueness was a variation of the perpendicular, plain to see and to account for. It is no longer that.
Even as a young woman, she liked to say about her poetry, I'm not sure that this is poetry. I'm not making any claims for it as poetry. It's the way I want it to be. It is language under the conditions I believe in. And she was extraordinarily, I think we would say, gutsy about her sense that this is what she wanted, this and no other.
She wanted her poetry to be natural. This was of the greatest importance to her. Natural, straightforward. She said, does this sound natural, as though I were talking to you? Well, that's what I think it ought.
In the air in England, when I was starting to write poetry, was the voice of Dylan Thomas. And if you turn on the radio, if you heard poetry at all on the radio, it'd be Dylan Thomas reading. And everything was so hotted up. It was so marvelous to come across these wonderful, cool poems, which at the same time had a kind of intellectual passion about them, too.
I admired that woman in a way. My God, if you've ever seen her, I've ever written about her. She was magic to me. She was a beautiful woman.
Dear Badger, I have an Airedale coat, and I'm going to New York on Monday.
New York City, 1915. Already the architect's poem, bastion of the Jazz Age, laboratory for painters, photographers, and sculptors. Everywhere, established methods of design are being shattered to suit individual visions. Poets and publishers experiment with Ezra Pound's credo from overseas to take the language and make it new.
1915
was a very important year for Marianne Moore. It was the year of her first professional publications, and probably the year that she most firmly realized that she was going to become a poet.
Moore wrote to her brother about her New York expeditions, which she nicknamed her Sojourns in the Whale.
Dear Badger, went to 291 to see some of Alfred Stieglitz's photography. He has a magnificent little thing of the sea in dark blue and some paintings of mountains by a man named Hartley. Also some Picabbias and Picassos and so on.
She took the opportunity in 1915 to insert herself for the first time into that world she was soon to join.
Dear Mr. Pound, I was graduated from Bryn Mawr in 1909. My mother and I are living at present in New York in a small apartment. I like New York, the little quiet part of it in which my mother and I live. I like to see the tops of the masts from our door and to go to the wharf and look at the craft on the river.
Working at first in relative isolation, Moore published in such respected journals as Others, The Egoist, and Poetry. She was soon embraced by a small but important group of admirers, the other modernist poets.
April 17, 1921. Dear Mr. Eliot, your letter gives me great pleasure. It is a happiness to know that I am not quite a stranger to you. Were I to publish verses, I should be grateful indeed for the assistance you offer. Your suggestion tempts me almost beyond my own certain knowledge that I have nothing that ought to appear in book form.
Despite her protests, the first volume of Moore's poems was published by some friends in England.
These poems are not outward glances upon the external world. They are unbelievably, or quite believably, moralizing sentiments about the nature of, I believe, the poet's self. They are extreme emotional statements.
The fish wade through black jade. Of the crow-blue mussel shells, one keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. The barnacles, which encrust the side of the wave, cannot hide there, for the submerged shafts of the sun, split like spun glass, move themselves with spotlight swiftness into the crevices, in and out, illuminating the turquoise sea of bodies. The water drives a wedge of iron through the iron edge of the cliff, whereupon the stars, pink rice grains, ink-bespattered jellyfish, crabs like green lilies, and submarine toadstools slide each on the other. All external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice. All the physical features of accident, lack of cornice, dynamite grooves, burns, and hatchet strokes, these things stand out on it. The chasm side is dead. Repeated evidence has proved that it can live on what cannot revive its youth. The sea grows old in it.
The sea grows old in it. Now, this is a program for survival, and she is very explicit about the ruins of experience. The chasm side is dead, she says, at 28. And I feel that this is a very profound and prophetic poem about the damages of a lifetime and the understood and acknowledged and accepted scars of experience.
Marianne Moore spent her earliest years in Kirkwood, Missouri, in the home of her grandfather, the Reverend John Riddle Warner. Shortly before she was born, in 1887, her father, a failed inventor, was hospitalized for a nervous breakdown and never returned to the family.
Marianne never knew her father, never met him. And when she was 6 years old, the grandfather went to a funeral, stood out in the icy rain, caught pneumonia, and died, leaving them stranded once again. Everybody that they had relied upon in their early life had either died or disappeared. The three of them clung to one another and became just desperately mutually reinforcing.
I've never known a mother and a daughter to be so close, or to be so happy with one another, and to be so joyful with one another, because they were always making each other laugh.
Like two sisters. You never saw one without the other.
I remember once when I was there, and Marianne was distressed because she'd come to a halt in a poem that she was writing, and she couldn't find her way out. And her mother said quite calmly, "Well, show it to me. I'll tell you how to get out." And she did, right then and there.
In 1905, Moore began study at Bryn Mawr. Denied an English major, she chose history and political economy.
Dearest family, I am not going to discuss my work. There is an appalling amount. It is all interesting, and I am doing the best I can. For our dance, I shall wear my gray lab apron and pin a white paper circle on it to represent an amoeba, with oceans and oceans of love.
I think the laboratory methods carried over into the way she worked and the way she wrote.
With Miss Moore, a word is a word most when it is separated out by science, treated with acid to remove the smudges, washed, dried, and placed right side up on a clean surface. Now one may say that this is a word. Now it may be used. William Carlos Williams.
A jellyfish, visible, invisible, a fluctuating charm, an amber-tinctured amethyst inhabits it. Your arm approaches, and it opens, and it closes. You had meant to catch it, and it quivers. You abandon your intent. Dear family, I had an interview today. Miss Fullerton says, "Please, a little lucidity. Your obscurity becomes greater and greater." I may be overconfident, but I think I shall get there someday in the matter of writing. If I do not, I shall wonder about the justice of my having been plagued with the fever.
A Grave was written shortly after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1917 and America's entry into World War I. It's a poem about the sea, and we know that Marianne Moore loved the sea, but at about the time she was writing the poem, her brother, who was a Presbyterian minister, took on the role of a Navy chaplain and was at sea in wartime. So the sense of the sea as a grave, both a past one and a potential one, was very, very true to her.
She and her mother were up in Maine, and they were looking out at the ocean, and somebody came along and stood right in front of them. And her mother made the offhanded comment about how often people feel they have to stand right in the middle of a thing rather than stand back and look at it, which gave her the initial idea for the poem.
Man looking into the sea, taking the view from those who have as much right to it as you have to it yourself. It is human nature to stand in the middle of a thing, but you cannot stand in the middle of this. The sea has nothing to give but a well-excavated grave. The sea is a collector, quick to return a rapacious look. There are others besides you who have worn that look, whose expression is no longer a protest. The fish no longer investigate them, for their bones have not lasted. Men lower nets, unconscious of the fact that they are desecrating a grave, and row quickly away, the blades of the oars moving together like the feet of water spiders, as if there were no such thing as death. And the ocean, under the pulsation of lighthouses and noise of bellboys, advances as usual, looking as if it were not that ocean in which dropped things are bound to sink, in which, if they turn and twist, it is neither with volition nor consciousness.
When she's writing about the sea, which is one of her great subjects and one of her consistent thematics, it seems to me that she sounds more like Whitman than anyone else has ever sounded like him, and that she understands his diction and his natural rhythms and his breathing, and it is very close to her own. And those are moments when I love her very much and where I feel that she escaped or evaded her own, what I'm calling her own propriety.
I think not only will a close study of particular poems reveal the nature of the person, but also the environment in which she lived, and in particular, her bed-sitting room, which after her death was moved intact to Philadelphia and is preserved with every object exactly in the place in which she left it. In a way in which no other format can quite convey, I think walking into that room gives you a very real sense of what the person was like.
I get up early.
What is early?
Oh, 6, sometimes earlier, or 7. I drink a little orange juice, eat some farina, eat a banana, and then I get out my work. I work till I have to sleep.
You go at it like it was a regular job. Get to work and get it done.
Exactly. People think that's not romantic. No, it isn't, but that's the way I am.
Well, I thought you sat down and these beautiful thoughts would come to your mind.
They float into the mind, and you have a nice, clean piece of paper. No, indeed. I save up things that I like pretty well until I need them.
How do you save them? Do you have little catalogs?
No, I have a little book. It's called School Assignments.
Well, she was always darting about from one thing to another, making her own discoveries. We would go to see a certain exhibition, but she would always find something else that she liked better. She loved Joseph Cornell, who was a kindred artist. It was the same kind of creativity, this seeking out things that appealed to her and assembling them.
As she collected them, she would begin to put things together that had associations only in her own mind. And then eventually, out of a collection of very disparate things, I mean, photographs, postcards, tear sheets from magazines, newspaper clippings, advertising leaflets that she got in the mail, out of the association between all of these things would eventually come a poem.
One of my favorites is a clipping showing a plummet basilisk on the hand of a zookeeper. And not only does the plummet basilisk work itself into a poem, but the very caption used by the journalist for this basilisk becomes a line in her poem about it.
The poem No Swan So Fine, for example, she had clipped a photograph of the fountain in front of the palace at Versailles, and she had written across the top of the clipping, "There is no water so still as the dead fountains of Versailles."
Then, at about the same time, in the Illustrated London News, she saw an ad for a sale at Christie's auction house. And one of the things being offered for sale was a pair of candelabra. Because she apparently didn't own that magazine, she took out her notebook and made a drawing.
Now, according to an entry in the poet's notebook, the Swan had decorated a Louis XV candelabra owned by Lord Balfour. She was dejected about the passing of Lord Balfour, and she was also dejected about the impending cessation of Poetry magazine, as she wrote to her brother.
So these images of passing are present and became the poem about a swan candelabrum that shows how it remains because it is something beautiful and somehow sturdy enough, although fragile, to survive.
No water so still as the dead fountains of Versailles. No swan with swart-blind look askance and gondoliering legs, so fine as the chintz china one, with fawn-brown eyes and toothed gold collar on to show whose bird it was. Lodged in the Louis XV candelabrum tree of coxcomb-tinted buttons, dahlias, sea urchins, and everlastings, it perches on the branching foam of polished, sculptured flowers, at ease and tall. The king is dead.
An Octopus is a poem that grew out of two wonderful trips Marianne Moore took to Seattle in the early 1920s. She went by train through the Canadian Rockies and then by boat to Seattle.
August 25th, 1923. When we got to Seattle, we were overwhelmed with joy to see Warner on the dock.
The occasion was very special. Marianne, her mother, and her brother had not been alone together in their original family unit for several years. And they decided to go up to what's called Paradise Park on the side of Mount Rainier.
September 6, 1923. We are having sunshine all the time and views of Mount Rainier with pale rose shadows on it, which delight even my seared to nature heart. And after dark, it is so cold we have to have a fire indoors.
Paradise Inn is located just below the Nisqually Glacier, which is one of the most dramatic of the 8 major glaciers that make up the 8-armed octopus. And you get up close to the glacier, which is often clouded over, and then there it is, this huge crevice, and snow and ice creeping slowly, as she says in the poem, down the mountainside. And that she certainly saw, because we have pictures of her seated at the very rock that is the furthest point you can go to look at the glacier. And then Marianne and her brother rented whatever hiking gear they needed to go on a visit to the ice caves. And she describes them in the poem as the grottos which make you wonder why you came. They're so cold and icy, of course, even though this was the middle of summer. A very different set of sceneries than one sees in the beautiful wildflower gardens around Paradise Inn. More the dark side of the mountain, the threatening side, that becomes important in her poem. One of the most important influences on the finished poem, An Octopus, was a brochure put out by the National Park Service about Mount Rainier. One of the subheadings in the description of the mountain is An Octopus of Ice, and that became Marianne Moore's title and the first 2 words of the first line of the poem. On the cover is an aerial map of Mount Rainier, and it's very obvious that there are 8 major glaciers running down the sides.
An octopus of ice, deceptively reserved and flat, it lies in grandeur and in mass beneath a sea of shifting snow dunes. Dots of cyclamen red and maroon on its clearly defined pseudopodia made of glass that will bend, a much-needed invention. Comprising 28 ice fields from 50 to 500 feet thick of unimagined delicacy. Picking periwinkles from the cracks or killing prey with the concentric, crushing rigor of the python, it hovers forward, spider fashion, on its arms misleadingly like lace. Its ghostly pallor changing to the green metallic tinge of an anemone-starred pool. The fir trees, in the magnitude of their root systems, rise aloof from these maneuvers, creepy to behold. austere specimens of our American royal families, each like the shadow of the one beside it.
Miraculously, she could take something from the national parks regulation or whatever, and by her cutting of it, because she doesn't always quote direct. I mean, often when she quotes Ruskin, she'll cut him down. She'll cut all that eloquence out. It's if she can subject this whole thing to herself and yet have this nice tension between what somebody else has said and the way she looks at it.
Completing a circle, you have been deceived into thinking that you have progressed under the polite needles of the larches, hung to filter, not to intercept the sunlight, met by tightly wattled spruce twigs conformed to an edge like clipped cypress, as if no branch could penetrate the cold beyond its company. And farther up, in stag at bay position, as a scintillating fragment of these terrible stalagmites, stands the goat, its eye fixed on the waterfall which never seems to fall, an endless skein swayed by the wind, immune to force of gravity in the perspective of the peaks.
The discovery that at least 2/3 of the poem is quotation of one kind or another, I think, is very important to our understanding of the author's bringing together disparate material to make what becomes a seamless whole.
It's as though the actual physical experience had to still be reinforced by documentary evidence.
She just wanted to take chunks of her reading then and simply put it side by side like a cubist collage and let you run straight the way through it.
Distinguished by a beauty of which the visitor dare never fully speak at home for fear of being stoned as an impostor, Big Snow Mountain is the home of a diversity of creatures.
Right in the middle of the poem, there is a reference to the Greeks. I worried about that for a long time, and one day after a walk in the woods next to the house, I suddenly realized, Dante, that's a quotation from the Inferno.
Like happy souls in hell, enjoying mental difficulties, the Greeks amused themselves with delicate behavior because it was so noble and so fair. Not practiced in adapting their intelligence to eagle traps and snowshoes, to alpenstocks and other toys contrived by those alive to the advantage of invigorating pleasures. The Greeks liked smoothness, distrusting what was back of what could not be clearly seen.
Although on one surface the poem is almost entirely the work of an astute observer of nature, it is also a statement that there is a natural paradise that we can observe, and we, the observer, are responsible for its being maintained as a paradise or becoming a hell.
Is tree the word for these things, flat on the ground like vines? Some bent in a half circle with branches on one side suggesting dust brushes, not trees. Some finding strength in union, forming little stunted groves, their flattened mats of branches shrunk in trying to escape from the hard mountain, planed by ice and polished by the wind. The white volcano with no weather side, the lightning flashing at its base, rain falling in the valleys and snow falling on the peak, the glassy octopus symmetrically pointed, its claw cut by the avalanche with a sound like the crack of a rifle, in a curtain of powdered snow launched like a waterfall.
I think she found in the behavior of animals an inspiration for the direction in which human behavior ought to be comported.
The zebras, supreme in their abnormality. If compression is the first grace of style, you have it.
Her poems are really not about animals. Her poems are about herself. And she uses this extraordinary manner of appearing to describe exactly in what I call a zoophrasty, a world of suffused understatement about herself.
Another armored animal, scale lapping scale with spruce cone regularity until they form the uninterrupted central tail row. This near artichoke with head and legs.
Her emotions are armored slightly so that we have to dig quite deeply to realize the relative depth of an emotion that's being expressed.
Now, the jerboa, Miss Donnelly at Bryn Mawr said, we like your animals, but don't you ever write about anything else.
He feared snakes and tamed Pharaoh's rat, the rust-backed mongoose. No bust of it was made, but there was pleasure for the rat. Its restlessness was its excellence. It was praised for its wit. And the jerboa, like it, a small desert rat and not famous, that lives without water, has happiness. By fifths and sevenths, in leaps of 2 lengths, like the uneven notes of the Bedouin flute, it stops its gleaning on little wheel casters and makes fern seed footprints with kangaroo speed. Its leaps should be set to the flageolet, pillar body erect on a 3-cornered, smooth-working Chippendale claw, propped on hind legs and tail as 3rd toe, between leaps to its burrow.
She was often asked about technique because of the particular brand of syllabic verse that she had invented.
That is a pattern in which the numbers of syllables determine the line rather than stresses.
In one line you'll have 6, another you have 3, another you have 19 or something. Now, if you're writing iambic pentameters, all right, you start by counting on your fingers, but then it becomes natural and you can just write an iambic pentameters. But I think you have to keep going back and remind yourself, you know, it's just 19 syllables, then I go down to 3. I don't think you can carry all that in your head so easily. So I think there's a certain distancing of it all in the act of writing.
I had published some little pamphlets of poems by friends of mine when I was very young, because no one else would publish them. And she liked the pamphlets. She called them, they were this size, and she called them Dinky Deluxe. And I said, well, Marianne, I want you to write one for me. And so she said she would.
You know, she often talked about poetry as prose. She would say her poem Marriage, for example, is just a collection of prose statements, statements she wished to keep, that she couldn't bear to lose.
It's Marianne's view of marriage from every angle. And as anyone will see when he reads it, she had reservations about the whole subject and wrote about it brilliantly and so wittily. And there's some very, very amusing lines in it.
I'm the last person to speak with authority when I ask a question or buy something, purchase something from a stranger. I'm always answered, yes, miss, or no, miss. And I think it is a height of temerity for me to read this. You can imagine the lines as ending with a question mark, or you can say sour grapes, and I'll take it in good part. Marriage. What an institution. Perhaps one should say enterprise. Enterprise, requiring public promises of one's intention to fulfill a private obligation. I wonder what Adam and Eve think of it by this time.
The poem itself is subdivided into about 10 sections, and each one has its own separate approach, and that's why it's so variously entertaining as you read from one section to the other.
This fire-gilt steel, alive with goldenness, how bright it shows of circular traditions, and impostures committing many spoils, requiring all one's criminal ingenuity to avoid. Psychology, which explains everything, explains nothing, and we are still in doubt. Eve, beautiful woman. I have seen her when she was so handsome she gave me a start, able to write simultaneously in 3 languages, English, German, and French, and talk in the meantime. Equally positive in demanding a commotion and in stipulating quiet. I should like to be alone. To which the visitor replies, I should like to be alone. Why not be alone together? Below the incandescent stars, below the incandescent fruit, the strange experience of beauty, its existence is too much. It tears one to pieces. She says, men are monopolists of stars, garters, buttons, and other shining baubles, unfit to be the guardians of another person's happiness. He says, these mummies must be handled carefully. The crumbs from a lion's meal, a couple of shins and the bit of an ear. Turn to the letter M, and you will find that a wife is a coffin. She says, this butterfly, this waterfly, this nomad that has proposed to settle on my hand for life, what can one do with it? There must have been more time in Shakespeare's day to sit and watch a play. You know so many artists who are fools. He says, you know so many fools who are not artists.
One of the great curiosities is that when her mother died in 1947, and she ordered the gravestone for her mother, on which her name was also to be inscribed, she instructed the stonecutter to leave a space under her name for the name of her husband, should she marry. She was 60 years old at that particular moment.
Everything to do with love is mystery. It is more than a day's work to investigate this science.
There is no such thing as a writer who is not erotic, because language itself is an expression of eros, and Marianne Moore is not only no exception, but she's a splendid example of a writer who is charged with erotic energy.
There's the famous occasion when she had that snake, you know, and they put it around her neck and said to her, what does it feel like? And she said, it feels like rose petals. And, you know, that sense of things feeling like rose petals, I think all over the place you find this extraordinary sense of what an animal feels like, what a certain light is like, lots of color. And I think all that is very, very, very sensuous. Though whether it's erotic, I suppose, is another story.
She was a special creature in the face of the earth. She was, I never saw a more sexual woman who was remoter from all those things. Every damn thing was turned into a little twisted turn.
When she first went to work at the Dial, she informed Sibley Watson, one of the owners of the Dial, that one of the things she had to have time off for was a series of tango lessons that she was then taking.
The Dial magazine in 1920 was on its way to becoming the most highly revered magazine of arts and letters of the period.
In May 1925, Moore left her job at the public library to become acting editor of the Dial. From modest beginnings, Moore became one of the most powerful arbiters of modernist verse.
Marianne and her mother both were extremely puritanical, and there were stories that were submitted to the Dial which she found objectionable. And she was very severe about it, and she turned down a lot of first-rate literature.
There was nothing flippant about her disapproval or rejection. It was always based on principle and on good principle.
She was too good a poet to be a perfect editor. I think Gilbert Seldes was the best editor we had. He wasn't a poet, but you had to be looser in your attitudes. Marianne Moore every damn sentence had to be right, you know. And poets, you can't edit a magazine that way.
In July 1929, the Dial folded. As editor, Moore had written nearly 200 prose pieces, but no poetry.
That left Marianne Moore without a job, and it would seem from what I can glean from letters and notebooks that it was a depressing period that she came out of by about 1932 when she began to publish again.
Decorum marked the life on Clinton Hill in the autumn of 1929, when my mother and I came to Brooklyn to live. A city of churches, Brooklyn might also be called a city of trees.
If you happen to know, for example, that the Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn was undergoing steeple repair in about 1930 or 31 because the subway was being dug underground nearby and was upsetting the footing of the church itself, you begin to realize why a steeplejack might have some meaning in Marianne Moore's immediate world.
A steeplejack in red has let a rope down as a spider spins a thread. He might be part of a novel, but on the sidewalk a sign says C.J. Poole Steeplejack in black and white, and one in red and in white says danger. You keep thinking the sentence is coming to an end, and she keeps giving you a bit more. And when you've got down to and in white says, you think, oh, she goes a bit further, leaps over a stanza break with the word danger.
The steeplejack is both Brooklyn and various New England seacoast towns I had visited. Miss Moore once wrote to a reader named Barbara Kurtz. The whales had been found in Brooklyn Bay.
And that would be an amazing event for someone with her interests. So we begin to realize that the poem grows out of her real life.
Durer would have seen a reason for living in a town like this, with 8-stranded whales to look at, with the sweet sea air coming into your house on a fine day, from water etched with waves as formal as the scales on a fish. A sea the purple of the peacock's neck is paled to greenish azure, as Durer changed the pine green of the Tyrol to peacock blue and guinea gray. The whirlwind fife and drum of the storm bends the salt marsh grass, disturbs stars in the sky and the star on the steeple. It is a privilege to see so much confusion. The college student named Ambrose sits on the hillside with his not native books and hat and sees boats at sea progress, white and rigid as if in a groove. Liking an elegance of which the source is not bravado, he knows by heart the antique sugar bowl-shaped summer house of interlacing slats and the pitch of the church spire, from which a steeplejack in red is letting a rope down as a spider spins a thread. He might be part of a novel, but on the sidewalk, a sign says, C.J. Poole, Steeplejack, in black and white, and one in red and white says, danger. The place has a schoolhouse, a post office in a store, fish houses, hen houses, a 3-masted schooner on the stocks. The hero, the student, the steeplejack, each in his way is at home. It could not be dangerous to be living in a town like this, of simple people, who have a steeplejack placing danger signs by the church while he is gilding the solid pointed star, which on a steeple stands for hope.
I mean, I've not been back to that part of Brooklyn, but going down that street with its wooden facades and its wooden balconies up to that 5th story where she lived, I felt it felt like a real neighborhood. Then we went out to a little cafe and so on. I think the fact was she was rooted in a way Pan never was. I mean, she was rooted in Brooklyn. And she insisted she lived in Brooklyn, not in New York. I don't live in town, I live in Brooklyn.
I would be dining with Marianne, and I would leave the museum and take the subway to Macy's. And there I would provide myself with my gifts for the evening, which were apricot juice, which was their favorite beverage. One of the delights of my life was to see the relish with which they consumed these things. They sipped like a hummingbird, this apricot juice. They loved it so much.
T.S. Eliot would come maybe a couple of times during the year, and he would say to her, when you finish your book, let me have one. And when I finish mine, I will send you one. I think Marianne Moore really loved T.S. Eliot. I really do. And they seemed to enjoy each other so much, being together. But when she got the message he'd married, that was a little more than I think that she could take it. She felt quite bad about it for quite a while.
The New York Telephone Company included a little flyer in with the phone bill one month, and it offered information about 4 quartz crystal clocks and explained that these clocks were used to maintain the most accurate time anywhere.
At the tone, the time will be 10:46 and 30 seconds.
Well, it's typical, isn't it, that she takes a pamphlet put out by the Bell Telephone Company, where you wouldn't go for inspiration, would you? And yet she finds it there. And I think it's this whole thing that she can take something which isn't inspired and use it. I mean, she uses so many phrases from a pamphlet, and yet, again, you've got her own voice in the whole poem.
There are 4 vibrators, the world's exactest clocks, and these quartz timepieces that tell time intervals to other clocks, these worksless clocks, work well. Independently the same, kept in the 41-degree Bell Laboratory time vault.
The whole theme of the poem is accuracy, that if the time given isn't accurate, it's no good. Then she apparently goes off at a tangent saying that for a scientist, accuracy is the thing. And she says the Lemur student can see that an eye is not an Angwang Thibaut, Potto or Loris. Then she goes on with other examples of the way accuracy can make you clear-headed, she says. And in saying it, I think she's got the most wonderful noise in the poem. Nobody else made a noise like this, but it's a noise which has got a meaning. She says, the seaside burden should not embarrass the bellboy with a boy ball endeavoring to pass hotel patronesses, nor could a practiced ear confuse the glass eyes for taxidermists with eyeglasses from the optometrist, where all the time she's talking, the mind's got to dance around and distinguish these things from one another.
And as Meridian 71212 gives each 15th second in the same voice the new data, the time will be so-and-so, you realize that when you hear the signal, you'll be hearing Jupiter, or Jur Pater, the day god, the salvaged son of Father Time, telling the cannibal Kronos, eater of his proxime newborn progeny, that punctuality is not a crime.
At the tone, the time will be 5 o'clock.
As Mrs. Moore had become ill, Marianne took up translating the Fables of La Fontaine to distract herself from the pain of this. And when her mother died, it meant a necessary change in her life. She'd lost her best friend, her best critic, the most important reader of her verse. And we do begin to see a change after 1947, when this wonderful audience was taken away from her.
And I felt so sorry. I really felt sorry for her. And she cried many, 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 many nights, many nights.
In 1951, Marianne Moore's book, The Collected Poems, won the Triple Crown, the National Book Award, the Bollingen Prize, and the Pulitzer Prize. And this brought her a kind of celebrity that was a quantum leap greater than that which she'd had before. And she became the media's darling.
You know, from the beginning to about 1935, you've got this poet of great probity and care with a personality held at a distance. Then she's discovered by the New Yorker, and she appears in the newspapers, and she wears her big hat, and she's at the ball game, and so on. And she becomes a national pet.
Her obsession with baseball, of course, and her Brooklyn Dodgers is known everywhere, thanks to the poem that she wrote about it.
Fanaticism? No. Writing is exciting, and baseball is like writing. You can never tell with either how it will go or what you will do.
All those Dodgers are quite dear to me. Gil, Pee Wee.
Roy Campanella was
and
one of...
Roy, first of all. He's the first who got me so bewitched about it all.
She was an adorable old lady. We needed a grandmother in our poetry. And even someone who admired and understood her true subversive and radical and wrenchingly emotional qualities, like Elizabeth Bishop in her poem to Marianne Moore, the invitation to Miss Marianne Moore, please come flying. That poem did more harm than good, I think, in the sense of describing her as a kind of benevolent witch, Glinda the Good, who's going to come to New York and fix up everything.
Ford Motor Company had had a wonderful success with the Thunderbird. The name alone, not to mention the sleek styling, had sold many sports cars. And now it was time. They hoped for another wonderful name for a sports car, and they engaged Marianne Moore to create a name.
I am complimented to be recruited in this high matter. I have seen and admired Thunderbird as a Ford designation. It would be hard to match, but let me the coming week talk with my brother, who would bring ardor and imagination to bear on the quest.
She thought this was a marvelous assignment. She was so excited by it. And she just looked forward to the conclusion of a triumphant naming of the new car. And she submitted hundreds of names to them. And she would telephone me and read off these names, which are the most improbable names for an automobile that anyone had ever conceived.
And she did a great deal of research in the library and with botanical books and zoological books, and came up with names like the Utopian Turtle Top or the Mongoose Civique. And time passed, and Ford finally had to choose a name, and they wrote to Marianne Moore and said,
"Our name, dear Miss Moore, is Edsel. I hope you will understand."
Her interest in images extended to her own persona. From at least the time when she was in college, she was intensely interested in devising the way she appeared. Sometimes she would put together a whole outfit, and then she would go down into the subway to one of these little booths where you could take your own picture to see whether or not the effect that she wanted to achieve by this outfit came across in photography.
The photographer who began the process of helping Marianne Moore define her image was George Platt Lynes, who created her most famous photograph of herself in a tricorn hat and cape.
November 2, 1950. Dear George, there is a very fine modesty about these pictures. The designs have authority, and I thank you hand on heart for the Helena Rubinsteining of difficult assets like eyelashes, furrows of thought. As for the focus on the hem and seaming of the gloves, it about does away with my fondness for fog and furry effects.
You like big hats?
Yes.
Why?
Because they hide my face somewhat.
Oh.
That's why I feel at home under one.
A face. I am not treacherous, callous, jealous, superstitious, supercilious, venomous, or absolutely hideous. Studying and studying its expression, exasperated desperation, though at no real impasse, would gladly break the glass. When love of order, ardor, uncircuitous simplicity with an expression of inquiry are all one needs to be. Certain faces, a few, one or two, or one face photographed by recollection, to my mind, to my sight, must remain a delight.
Major funding for the Voices and Visions series is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Annenberg Media.
Additional series funding is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Special funding for this program is provided by the New York Council for the Humanities, the Seth Sprague Educational and Charitable Foundation, and the Axe Houghton Foundation.
For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.